Hey everybody, it's Peter Robbins with Wargaming with Peter, and I have with me again esteemed guest Phil Sabin, and we're here to talk through the decades worth of development of Legion as it is currently called. Why don't you set up? Why don't you give us a little background on where things started, how it relates to Lost Battles, and then where you took it from there. Let's just go for
Sure.
it.
Okay. In brief, Legion is an attempt to use hex grid mechanics with figures principally. I mean, I play it principally with figures, but it's also entirely possible to play it as a board game with counters, and that's how it's been published. It grew out of a simpler system, Phalanx, which I published in the early 1990s, based on Phil Barker's DBA. Legion is my hex grid equivalent of DBM, if you like. And it was published in 1997. And I realized that people weren't playing it, certainly not with figures, because they didn't like the hexes. They didn't like having to produce all the hexes. So I moved away from hexes for quite a long time with my Lost Battles system, just to a smaller grid of squares, and didn't come back to Legion for decades. Not until a fan of Legion, and there are still some, Justin Swanton in South Africa, produced a nice deluxe edition, color edition of Legion, with the Society of Ancients with cut-out color counters in 2015. And a few years after that, I was playing around with the fast play rules in the original Legion, which only cover one scenario, Zama. But I realized that with not too much extra effort, I could generalize those fast play rules to cover all of the 36 battles. And that's what I've done with Legion 2. My tastes have changed very much over that period. Legion, I now find very complex. Some people still like it, and that's fine, and
Right.
it still can be played. But I find it's far too complex for my current tastes. So I'm really pleased that I've been able to produce a fast play Legion 2, which is, I think, just as accurate, and certainly is easier to grasp and can cover all the battles, not just one.
Very good. And Legion 2 itself, I think you have on your web linked off your website. Is that correct, or is it?
Yeah. Legion 2 is free. The link is there on the web. It's on the Legion page on Board Game Geek. I use Board Game Geek to post pretty much all of my conversions. So the original Legion site has everything, including quite a lot. About half of the scenarios have after action reports now with pictures, and also there's the video there that I produced of the Battle of Cromesus. So all the resources are there. You will need the original Legion to play Legion 2, either because you want the counters, or even if you want to play it as I do as a figure game, or indeed using the Vassal set, which Justin and Edwin Shaw have very kindly made. You will need the original rules. Those, however, are still available from the Society of Ancients. They're quite inexpensive. And once you have that, you can play either version of Legion. But you do need those basic rules just as a core.
And how, if we could relate it back to how you depicted your game designs over the years through Lost Battles, like how do you still feel, I assume, that Lost Battles is compatible, if you will, with play of Legion 2? Another, the main difference, well, why don't you just describe what are main differences in the rule set that, as described in Lost Battles, the book,
Sure.
versus where you're at now with the fast play of Legion 2?
There's a lot of commonality. The most important elements of that, the focus on troop quality, that really good troops are far, far better than masses of levies, for example. The focus on modeling generalship, so that Alexander and Hannibal are far better than other generals, and that's an asset that's given to the players and hard coded into the system. The fact that all the scenarios are real historical battles. It's not just imaginary encounters, as is typical with miniatures rules, for example. It's all about simulating real battles. Most of them are pretty asymmetric, so one side's far more likely to actually win a real battlefield victory, like Alexander or Hannibal, for example. But there's a handicap system built in, just as in golf, so that it balances the game, and you can win a game victory if you inflict more losses than the defeated side actually did before they were routed, for example. There's a simple system in all of the games whereby units start off fresh, they become spent as they take losses, and then they rout. The principal reason for that is that in real ancient battles, the victors often had no or very few units which actually routed off the field. But they were suffering nevertheless losses, they were having casualties, and that's reflected by their forces being spent, but they're better, and therefore by the time they're all spent, they've routed enough of the enemy units that the enemy army flees the field. So the victors are all still there, but the spent gives the enemy the victory points, which allow the handicap system to work. So all of those are commonalities, absolute commonalities between Lost Battles and Legion. The big difference, as I said, is that Legion has a fine hex grid, 21 by 17 hexes, whereas Lost Battles has only a 5 by 4 square grid. So Lost Battles is a much lower resolution model. It still produces the overall battlefield maneuvers, but you haven't got the fine detail of how units are relating to an enemy unit next to them. Within each of the grid squares, there's several units in Lost Battles, whereas there's only one unit in Legion. So Legion is a much more fine resolution model of the same phenomenon, and the two are intended to be complementary. Depending on which you prefer, you can play one or the other. But they're modeling very much the same engagements, exactly the same engagements in Legion 2, in fact, just with the difference in resolution.
So describe to me a little bit more about your philosophy around what is traditionally known as zone of control. I've noticed you stay away from zone of control, and you give more costs for movement near the enemy, which is very interesting. So what, from a designer perspective and from a historical perspective, what are you trying to emulate by doing it in that somewhat more granular way?
Okay. Zones of control are, as I discuss in my book, Simulating War, principally intended to allow you to have fine resolution hex grids, far finer even than Legion, without having hundreds of counters. So it allows a few counters to hold an extended front. That's not so much required in ancient warfare, because the troops didn't have the firepower, for example, to control over that area, and you haven't got the same degree of stacking as you have to have in order to model more recent campaigns and battles. And therefore, you can have armies of, let's say, 20 units aside. That's the number roughly in both Lost Battles and Legion. And with only a front of 20 hexes, you don't actually need zones of control. I do indeed model some effects close to the enemy, because one problem with systems which have no proximity rules at all, one thinks of TIE bombers, modern war games, forces can literally run rings around the enemy. If you've got 10 hexes and 9 units in TIE bombers games, you've got a hole in the front, and your forces with no zones of control can just run straight through them. Well, that's clearly unrealistic, partly because hexes themselves are artificial. If you had only 90% of the forces you need, you wouldn't have a one unit with hole in your line. You just spread them out a bit more. Hexes are artificial and force you either to have a unit or not. and zones of control, as I say, help finesse that. They're a very useful technique. I use them with modifications in my current Waterloo variant from the old Napoleon Waterloo game. But I don't see the need for them in the traditional form in my ancient games because, as I say, you haven't got that same problem of trying to cover, as you have in most modern campaigns, trying to cover a thinly held part of the front with fewer counters than you have hexes.
Let's see. How do you incorporate like baggage camps into your rules, and has that changed over the years based on research or otherwise?
Yeah. The role of camps in ancient warfare was interesting. It was as an objective for the enemy, in that if the enemy could take your baggage camp during the battle, perhaps that could provide a morale hit. In one case, the side that won the battle on the field, their forces rebelled and gave up their general to the enemy because their baggage had been taken. So it could be quite a crucial thing. They also provide, if they're fortified, they provide security, and you could have fortified armies confronting one another, and neither being willing to go very far from its camp, because that provided security. All of these things I model in both Legion and Lost Battles, but only as peripheral systems. The focus is on the battle in the open plain between the camps. And the camps, in certain cases, if they were close, are on the edge of the field, but they're there as an objective, and they can enhance deployment or limit deployment, which was one of the downsides of a fortified camp, that you only had gates of a certain width, and so you were actually a little constrained in coming out. But they rarely played a fundamental role in the battle, so they're there as peripheral features on the margins.
Which battle or battles would you say have been the most difficult to emulate, if you will, historically, or what have you found the most difficult to perhaps obtain historical results from, for one reason or another? I'm just curious if you've run into anything like that.
Sure. In Lost Battles, it wasn't just intended as a game system for entertainment. It was actually intended as a research tool. And one of the key principles there was that I wasn't going to permit myself to have special rules. Most games on every period of warfare, let's take the Great Battles of History series, for example, about ancient battles. They have the core rules, and then they simply add special rules for anything strange that happened. And with that, you could model pretty much anything. But I had a sort of self-denying principle that I would not have special rules, because I wanted to have a system which could, without tweaks, cover the whole waterfront, cover all of these different battles, do you see? I was pleasantly surprised that I could cover pretty much all of them without those kind of tweaks. And so, for example, let's take the Battle of the Granicus, 334 BC, Alexander's first battle in Persia. We know what happened. There is some debate, but the standard interpretation is that Alexander faced the Persian cavalry at the river, beat them, and then came across the Greek mercenary infantry on a hill behind the river. And it's often said, well, this is almost impossible to simulate if players have freedom of decision, because they'll put their infantry in the center guarding the river and the cavalry on the flanks, do you see, as the Persians. But my system incorporates deployment. And of course, the cavalry are faster than the infantry. It also incorporates command limits, so you can't do everything at once. And so in my systems, Legion and Lost Battles, you do get the Persians holding the riverbank with cavalry because they can get there quickly, and then Alexander can cross because he's got the initiative and the command benefits of a great general, and the poor old infantry can't get there in time, so they're stuck on the hill. They stay on the hill because that's about their only chance of holding out, as they did for a while, against Alexander in the second stage of the battle. So there's an example of a battle which many rules find difficult to simulate, which I find rather easier. Now, with Legion, that's not intended to be a research tool. It uses very much the same principles, but there's one thing that I make considerable use of in Legion, which does make simulating what happened in certain battles easier, and that's that I set arbitrarily, based on simulating what actually happened, panic thresholds for different parts of the army. Okay. And I can choose what to do there. So I'm just sort of painting a picture. It's like the special rules. But that does have advantages. If we take the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC, we know that half of the Seleucid army ran away almost at the outset. But then the other half fought quite hard and actually routed the Roman left. How on earth can one simulate that? Well, Lost Battles has a system which may give you that outcome, because some units rout and others don't, but it's by no means guaranteed to. Whereas in Legion, the weaker half of the Seleucid army has a very low panic threshold and is indeed likely to go, but the other half will indeed stay, and you can have quite a significant battle with half of the Seleucid army already having run away, do you see? But that shows you how useful it can be if you do have the flexibility to incorporate, in effect, special rules like I'm just going to set an arbitrary panic threshold in order to simulate what really happened.
And I am trying to read back over the panic thresholding. So you have different point values for panic thresholds for different types of units, of course, right? So like, of course, elephant units, heavy units have much larger. They're less potential to rout.
In Lost Battles,
right.
it essentially depends on the quality of the troops, and certain classes like heavy infantry are solider than others, but partly because they know that if they rout, they're not fast enough to get away. So it's in their interest to try and stay and fight. In Legion, there can be quite a lot of variation. Let's take the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC. Pompey, if you believe Caesar, literally had 7 times as many cavalry as Caesar did. And Caesar beat them by reinforcing his cavalry with legionaries. Now, that's partly handled by making Caesar's cavalry veteran and his legionaries, of course, and Pompey's troops more levy. But it's also handled by giving a very low panic threshold in Legion for that part of Pompey's army. And so it only takes a few units to be hit and routed, and the whole of that massive cavalry will run away, you see. So it shows how flexible you can be when you're God, and if you like. I mean, all designers are God. They can do whatever they like. They can simulate whatever they like. As I say, my self-denying ordinance in Lost Battles was not to do that on a battle-by-battle basis. If you're going to make a rule for one battle, it has to apply in the others as well.
Speaking of, so how do you handle potential lack of, let's say, ammunition, if you will, right? Lack of some rule sets. I don't know if you've played some rule sets where the more successful you are, sometimes you get depleted quicker, which makes some sense. But how do you simulate that in the Legion series?
There are a few instances in ancient warfare where running out of ammunition became an issue. So it's not as big of a problem as you get in later wars. There are some cases, the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, for example, where ammunition supply did matter. Essentially, it's a battle between a force of horse archers and several Roman legions. And the Romans at first were quite sanguine, because the normal thing was for the horse archers to fire off all the arrows in their quivers, and then fade away into the background. unfortunately, the Romans realized that the Parthian archers were going back to the camel train, which their general had cleverly laden with spare arrows, so that they were able to, over time, shoot the legions to pieces, and the legions could never catch them. Do you see? So that was an example where ammunition supply did matter. And I modelled that by making at least a proportion of the Parthian cavalry veteran, because clearly they've got, thanks to their general's foresight, far more fighting capability than typical horse archers would have. The other thing is that I mentioned spent status. Spent status in part reflects that you're running out of ammunition. So light troops, for example, will become spent and they have to go back. They can't keep fighting. One reason for that, they've thrown all their javelins. So they're not going to be much use if you try and put them back into the front, you see. So spent status is a wonderful abstract means of handling a whole series of things. They've lost some casualties, including to key officers. The troops are wounded, they're tired, their ammunition is getting low. All of those can be folded into this abstract status of spent, which means that one more push and they will actually leave the field.
So as you've probably experienced in other rule sets as well, in some rule sets, they allow light horse in particular to kind of absorb damage, if you will, or absorb hits by, in effect, withdrawing, right? I mean, do you have any withdrawal effects in the Legion series of note? And or has that changed over the time? What's your philosophy on that?
Both Legion and Lost Battles don't tend to use retreats. Napoleon at Waterloo, of course, the classic system, does indeed use retreats. And one of the key mechanisms in that game is if you can encircle the enemy with your zones of control, which we talked about earlier, then units that try to retreat won't be able to and will be broken. That's a key mechanism in the game. I don't tend to use retreats in Legion and Lost Battles, not forced ones anyway. Instead, I have units becoming spent and then routed. So they're never forced to retreat. However, if they are faster than the enemy, once they're spent, their general may well decide that he's going to pull them back so that spent units don't stay in front and get routed. In Lost Battles, that happens pretty much automatically in that you have several units in one of these big zones. The lead unit gets spent, and then the commander can decide it's not going to take the next hit as long as you've got a fresh unit that can take its place, do you see? In Legion, I have a similar system for spreading hits so that you don't get fresh units standing there and another unit routing, because there would actually be more collectivity to the combat. But I also have special rules whereby the Roman legions, for example, can replace their losses. They've got this line relief system, which is a unique feature of the Roman Republican system compared to its adversaries. And so to model that, I have various rules, including the fact that if you've got two lines of legionary units, the back line, even though it's not actually in combat, can absorb hits so that a spent unit in front gets hit, and then the unit behind, a fresh one, can take the next hit without the one in front being routed and without them physically having to replace them, do you see? So there are those mechanisms, but essentially it's a choice for the owning player rather than a forced retreat as in typical SPI Napoleon at Waterloo style games.
Right. I mean, yeah, I've seen in certain rules where they'll literally let a light infantry, or excuse me, a light horse unit physically retreat to basically absorb damage, which is so. I like your reasoning more. Throughout your systems, I feel like you have really good reasons for what you're showing and doing, which is wonderful. I wish more game designers would do exactly like what you've done, is write a book about why they wrote the rules the way they did.
And it does need a book. That's the point. Typically games have only about half or less, or probably only 10% design notes compared to the length of the rules, which are far too long usually.
Right.
I'm the reverse, but therefore you do need to have an entire book to justify all of the different choices that you've made. It's been described as the Lost Battles in the book form has been described as the game with the longest series of longest design notes in history.
Take that as a compliment.
Oh, absolutely,
yeah. So I like how surprise is gently introduced, basically via your deployment system, which is a little unique, I think, right? I mean, some systems have like a pre-game, right? And I like how you've basically reincorporated deployment into the battle itself as opposed to just a pre-game. And I like how you introduce surprise, which is in effect a delayed entry, right? More than anything.
In Legion and in Phalanx, deployment is required. I don't provide historical deployments, so the scenarios can be very simple because I just give what forces you've got, and then where you put them is up to you. And so in Legion, still in Legion 2, you are required to deploy your forces. In Lost Battles, you may, if you wish, but most people play it with the historical deployments that I provide, although those historical deployments are entirely compatible with the limits of deployment in the rules mechanisms. So the units aren't just put arbitrarily where they were. They have had also to conform with my deployment rules to make the two systems compatible. That allows, as you say, things like surprise to be incorporated. There are a number of battles, the Battle of the Sambre, for example, in 57 BC, where surprise was a key feature. The hordes of Gauls come pouring out of the woods on the far side of the river, and Caesar's forces are only gradually arriving. So he's got to hold off the Gauls with his initial forces while the others come on, you see. And so the balance in the game, what makes it really interesting is that Caesar's got the superior army, but as long as the Gauls hit quickly, they're going to be able to take advantage of the fact that only a few of Caesar's forces are there. It's a wonderful situation. What's interesting is that quite a number of battles in ancient history, you have in effect both armies surprised. The battle starts from a meeting engagement, Cynocephalae in 197 BC between the Romans and the Macedonians is a classic case. Patrols meet on a ridge between the two marching armies. Both generals gradually send up further forces and it escalates into a full-size battle. But it hadn't been planned, they hadn't laid out their battle lines beforehand, and my surprise rules, when applied to both sides, allow that kind of escalating engagement to be modeled.
For a scenario like that, would you like double it? Would you kind of extend that a little bit to kind of emphasize that aspect of the scenario, or not? Or do you feel like the rules as is cover that enough? You know what I mean? Like, would you? Yeah.
I think it works pretty well, actually. As I say, there's a number of battles: Cynocephalae, Pedna, Plataea, in which you can see the way in which the battle developed, the unplanned nature of it, and the gradual way that it escalated, as reflective of the fact that both sides were in effect surprised. There are other cases. I mentioned the Sambre, Chromesis, which is the one that's shown in the video. That was a classic one-sided surprise where the Greeks in effect ambushed the Carthaginians while they're trying to cross a river. And so the Carthaginian army is vastly bigger than theirs, but it's only gradually being fed in across the river fords while the Greeks are charging down and trying to beat the advance guard, and historically they succeed. So those are often the most interesting battles because of that asymmetry. It's not just two forces formally lining up and having to against one another. You have this key time dimension. That's, by the way, something that's crucial in all battles, I think, of all periods, but certainly in the ancient world, that they're a race against time, that one side is trying to win quickly in one part of the field before it loses in another. Typically, you get revolving door battles. You're superior on your right, so your right's trying to beat the enemy left before they do the same to you. Or in battles like Cannae, where your infantry are superior if you're the Romans, but your cavalry are inferior, you're trying to win with your infantry before the defeat on the flanks by the superior enemy cavalry encircles you. Do you see? But the key point is, in all these cases, time matters.
So then what would you pose as the ultimate victory point then in an ancient battle? Is a breakdown of morale more than anything?
Yeah. In most periods, and certainly in the ancient period, you get an army panicking. It dissolves into rout. And you see this happens at Waterloo, of course, that at one point the French army is there, and then it's just it's all completely in flight. We can understand how that happens. The army, in effect, becomes a crowd. If you look at it from the individual's point of view, each individual soldier is constantly making this judgment: are we likely to win? If we're not, if we're going to lose, I'd be better running now, because I don't want to be the last to run away, because I'll be killed by the pursuing enemy cavalry. You see? When enough people decide it's not going well, I'm going to save myself, the army collapses and it becomes a vicious circle. All right. In gunpowder era battles like Waterloo and Borodino and so on, that doesn't tend to happen until a lot of people have been killed on the field on both sides by these terrible gunpowder weapons. What happens in antiquity is that it's much more a contest of exhaustion and stress and so on, and not that many people are killed, maybe 10% or so, before the rout. And then in the rout or after the rout, huge numbers of the defeated are slaughtered. So you get a far bigger discrepancy, 10 times, even 100 times, between the casualties of the losers and the victors in ancient battles, mainly because not so many are killed in the battle themselves. They're protected by their shields and so on. It's when they run away that they're slaughtered from behind. So what's crucial is the moral battle to try and get the enemy to run away. And then you achieve the physical results by pursuing and slaughtering them.
Are there any good examples of battles ancient battles that took place over several days, like operational battles, if you will? Like you were already saying, a meeting engagement that became a larger battle, but sure. Are there any of particular note that took 2 to 3 days to really come to?
It's very rare. You don't get in the ancient world battles like Leipzig or Gettysburg, which are extended over multiple days. The battles typically last a few hours, and one side then dissolves into rout, and that's it. So it's done. What you do get, of course, is confrontations that take place over several days, as both sides are sparring and deciding whether to give full battle or not. Yeah. That happens, for example, at Plataea, where the Greeks first advance, there's skirmishing and cavalry attacks on them. They decide that they need to pull back from the ridge. They handle that ineptly, and the Persians then attack them, and that produces the battle on the final day. Okay, you get other cases where armies deploy in front of their camps for several days. Pharsalus between Caesar and Pompey is a good example of this. And they skirmish, but they don't actually formally have a battle until one side makes the initiative, and then the battle is decided. But it's usually only that we consider the battle. The rest of it is part of the setting up of the engagement.
So I know your deployment rules handle that, well within the day, I guess would we put it. But am I remembering correct that you had a campaign system with the Legion rules at one point or another in the box set as well? Is there?
Yeah, the box set is Lost Battles, right. And I pair that in the box game, which is now long out of print, I'm afraid. With a grand strategic game that I did, which was called Empire, which covers the period from 350 to 150 BC, and therefore includes about half of the battles in the set. And I do provide some linking rules which allow you to use a battle, an appropriate battle, a tactical battle, to decide a campaign rather than just rolling a die. Okay. I also provide some very simple campaign rules so that you can play several battles, like Alexander's battle is against Persia, and you play them successively, and the victor overall is the one who has the most points over that series of battles. So there are some campaign rules there, but as I say, it's a linkage of the grand strategic with the grand tactical. So it's not trying to do anything seriously operational. That has been done, of course, by other designers, Richard Berg, for example. But I don't try to do it myself. I have another system called Roma Invicta, which is more operational. The turns are 10 to 15 days, which covers the first 2 years of Hannibal's campaigns in Italy. So that does look more operationally, but again, it doesn't have a detailed model of the actual tactical battles. It just contents itself with the operational level.
Is that still for sale by any chance?
Yeah.
Great.
It's in my book, Simulating War, the latest version of it.
Oh, yeah.
And a slightly earlier version is still available as a board game from the Society of Ancients. Yeah, the beauty of publishing my games through the Society of Ancients is they tend to be kept in print, because in effect they're print on demand. They're not deluxe products. They look very nice. I mean, the Legion
Nice.
counters and so on look lovely. But as you can see, they're print and play. Much simpler to produce than die cut counters. Much cheaper to produce, and they can be kept in print because they'll just print some more when they run out. You see. So the good thing is all of my games from the Society of Ancients are still available if anybody wants them, and fairly cheaply.
Okay, so here's my next question. What is your favorite ancient rule system that you did not design?
That's a difficult one because I really find it hard to play other people's systems because inevitably I'll disagree with them and want to change it. Now, I'd be able easily to answer your question if I had done a tweaked version of somebody else's designs, as I have in other eras. For example, the game you see behind you is a tweaked version of Napoleon at Waterloo. I've produced tweaked versions of Horse and Musket by Sean Chick. Yeah, and then I could say, well, that's good, although I recommend you use my tweaks.
That makes you a war gamer, by the way.
Indeed. I don't play, I have to say, I don't play anybody else's Ancients rules. All of the ones I've done are mine from scratch. So I probably have to go back to, I like the simplicity of Phil Barker's modeling, particularly in DBA. Right. And indeed, Phalanx was originally inspired by the simplicity of DBA decades ago, and then has gone on to inspire various other of my designs.
I'm trying. There were some older ones like under like Featherstone's books and stuff and so forth, right?
Oh yeah, oh sure. Yeah, there's not. I mean, those don't tend to be very good. Tony, the ancient rules in Donald Featherstone's war games were actually the rules by Tony Bath, the founder of the Society of Ancients. But although they were great fun in their day, they're not very realistic, partly because they're designed for flat figures, which are the only ones available at the time, and therefore they don't take much account of frontages because flats are two-dimensional, one-dimensional, I suppose, depending which way you look at it. So
speaking of flat, sorry, I had a question from before that I didn't ask. Terrain. I mean, obviously, most of the battles were on a very relatively flat, plain or
sure.
or Sierra or whatever. If you, I need to go back and look at the more detailed rules in Legion 1. But how do you account for terrain? If
As you say, about half of the battles that I model, which are the best known from the last 5 centuries BC, have no terrain. They were just fought on open plains. In other battles, terrain did play a significant role. So I've got rules for rivers and hills and so on. What I do is distinct from, for example, the Great Battles of History series, is that there they have separate maps for each battle. The problem is we don't know the terrain in that detail, so most of the fine detail of their terrain is invented. I use that ignorance of the details to have a modular system. So I've got hill pieces. You saw some of them in what I showed you earlier. Here we are. There we are. Cut out and deploy on the hex grid, and that allows you to use the same hex grid for all of the battles, just with modular terrain. You see, the rules for them are what you would expect. You know, if you're defending on a hill with infantry, you've got an advantage if you're uphill. One of the things that the system shows very nicely is why terrain was less important in ancient warfare, in ancient battles, than it was later. In later battles, defending, for example, a river line was great because you had a great advantage against the enemy just trying to cross the river against you. In an ancient battle, both sides are attacking as well as defending. If you just sit there and let the enemy attack you, you'll be defeated in detail. Now, if you stand behind a river, like, for example, the Persians at Issus, they took a defensive position behind a river. The trouble is, Alexander then attacks you at your weakest point, and what are you going to do about it? The Persians then decide, well, they want to counterattack Alexander or Parmenio on the other flank. But in order to do so, they've got to cross the river themselves. So the river becomes an obstacle to them as much as it is to Alexander, do you see? The Spartans face the same problem at Sellasia. They've fortified a couple of hills on the road to Sparta. Up come the Macedonians, and lo and behold, they start attacking the left-hand hill from the Spartan point of view, and they're doing very well. Now, the Spartans themselves are on the right-hand hill, secure behind their fortifications. But what are they going to do? Are they just going to sit there and wait for their left to be destroyed, and then they're going to be outflanked? No, they want to attack. In order to attack, they have to tear down their own fortifications to get out to be able to attack the Macedonians while there's still time. Yeah. So this shows the limited role, the limited utility of defensive terrain in antiquity, because it stops you from advancing and attacking the enemy where you need to. And they can then choose where to attack you, and they don't need to worry about you attacking them.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Very good. This is in your own wargaming experiences. What has been the most fun battle that you've experienced? So just from a sheer low luck situation where somebody has pulled off a miraculous, or just is there any one moment in your history of wargaming that stands out still?
Yep, there is, and it wasn't using my rules, so I won't try and puff my my rules. It goes back to when I was a child, and I was in the Society of Ancients, and they had a system of championship battles. So this battle mattered in that it counted towards our points ranking in that year. And I was playing a school friend, and it was an imaginary battle. And the situation was that there was the main line, and then there was a big wood on the flank. And my opponent had his forces in his main line. I sent a significant proportion of mine round the wood. And my plan was that I'd hold him in the front, and meanwhile my forces would go round the wood, take him in the rear, and encircle him and destroy him, you see. And when he saw this, he was dumbfounded, but of course it was too late. The orders had been issued. Then things started to go wrong. He had some light infantry in the wood. They started shooting at my troops. My troops got a bit delayed. They started turning to defend themselves. Time started going on. His troops in the main line started to prevail, and my troops still hadn't got there. Okay, and in the end, his simple deployment in the main line won. And that taught me a very, very important lesson, which, of course, I've since discovered has been written about extensively by people like Clausewitz, great theorist of war. In war, the simplest thing is very difficult. There's this thing called friction, which means that complex plans fall apart. I learnt that as a 12-year-old boy when I tried to do something which I thought was militarily genius, but it was actually too complex, and his simple plan beat me. Yeah. So that it still sticks in my mind now, 50 years later, as an example of how wargaming can teach you some of the truths that the great theorists of war espouse. But armchair historians often say, oh, they should have done this, not realizing it's not that easy in reality. You need to balance complexity of tactics with what you can actually achieve and what your troops can actually achieve. And sometimes doing the simplest thing may prevail.
With a pinch of flexibility. Very good. I love that. I love that story. I think I'm going to end there just because I love that story, and that's a great. I love that. That's an exclamation point there. Yeah. Where to next for you? Just this is like. What are you working on? Are you working on anything in particular now? I assume you are emeritus at with King's College. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. I'm retired now. So when my baby allows, I'm spending all my time designing and playing war games, principally designing. You can see behind my further tweaked version of Napoleon at Waterloo. That will be coming out in about a week or two, along with a YouTube video. I really do recommend that, particularly if you've been watching the film Napoleon, because I think it gives a great and really fun simple model of that classic battle. Beyond that, I've done a lot of work recently on air warfare. And that's there on my website. Just Google Sabin War Games, and I've soon got to produce the finished version of a simple operational game of an attack on an enemy airfield in modern day for use principally by Air Force personnel. And that should be coming out in a month or two. And beyond that, lots of projects, including, I mentioned my conversion for horse and musket. I've got dozens of new scenarios that I need to devise for that, taking us from the 17th century up into the 18th and eventually the 19th centuries. So lots and lots of things on the boil. As I say, my website has the latest news, and most of these now I'm publishing for free as variants or freestanding games that people can just try as they wish.
Sounds awesome. I'm very interested in your operational modern air. So yeah, I might need to steal that from you at some point, or buy it wherever it's.
No, it'll be free. It'll be freely available. Don't worry.
Okay, cool. Great.
It's very simple, but it's one of the distinctive features of it, which otherwise only applies to a simple World War II dogfight system I produced 6 months ago, is that it has no luck, literally no luck. It is entirely a game of chess-like calculation.
Interesting.
But that calculation is very challenging. And so you really need to think in order to get the better of your opponent.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, as I say, that it's called Counter Air, and that will be published hopefully by UK Fight Club, a branch of the Ministry of Defence, the British Army, in a month or two.
Is the Royal Air Force interested in that, and they're going to expand upon it themselves, or just?
We shall see. We shall see.
Yeah.
I mean, I just done it as a private venture, if you like. But my, as we discussed last time, my Take That Hill similar land system has been used quite a lot by the British and other armies. So hopefully this other one will be popular, but we shall see.
Yeah, I know the RMAS at Sandhurst that's kind of expanded upon. You take that up.
Sure.
Great rule set. All right. Thank you
Okay.
very much
You
for
take care.
chatting, as always. And at some point I'll have to get my wargaming droogs together and do the operation, and I'll give you an after action report of how that goes.
That's fine.
Awesome.
Okay.
Take care.
You take care. See you.